Hey there, and welcome back to True Crime Echoes. If you're new here, I'm really glad you found this space. This is where we talk about real stories, stories that echo long after the headlines fade. And today's case is one that's haunted me for a while. It has everything: wealth, betrayal, family secrets, and a murder that left more questions than answers. And at the center of it all, a woman named Candy Mossler and the man she may have helped destroy. This isn't just a story about crime, it's about image, power, and what happens when the justice system is forced to look directly at privilege and flinches. So grab a moment for yourself, get comfortable, and let's talk about a case that still echoes decades later. Chapter 1: A Glamorous Woman. A Perfect Marriage. Or so it seemed. Hi friends, how are you today? I hope you're doing okay. Because the story I'm about to tell you is one of those that feels almost too wild to be true. But it is. It really happened. Now, before all the bloodshed, before the courtrooms and headlines, and before the secrets came pouring out, there was a woman named Candace. But everyone just called her Candy, and at first glance, Candy Mossler lived a life most people would envy. She was the type of woman people whispered about: tall, blonde, stunning, a socialite through and through, the kind who always looked like she belonged on the cover of a magazine. And she had this mysterious charm to her. No one really knew her age, and she liked it that way. Candy kept things vague, polished, and just out of reach. And then there was Jacques Mossler, her husband, a wealthy banker, a self-made millionaire. The man had built his fortune from the ground up, starting with nothing. He owned multiple finance companies and banks from Texas all the way to Florida. People described him as driven, intensely focused on work, but also warm, especially when it came to kids. Jacques had a soft spot. He'd grown up poor, raised by a single mother who did everything she could to give him a better life. And in return, Jacques made it his mission to help children however he could. I mean, that's the kind of man we're talking about here. Ambitious, yes, but also compassionate. The kind of guy who doesn't forget where he came from. Before, Candy Jacques had been married once and had 4 kids he absolutely adored. But when that marriage ended, his path crossed with Candy's. She was also newly divorced, and just like in a movie, they met, sparks flew, and by 1949 they were married. From the outside, it looked like the start of a fairy tale. They moved into a sprawling 28-bedroom mansion in Houston. 28 bedrooms. I mean, what do you even do with that many rooms? I don't know. But they had them. And Candy. She was living her dream. Lavish vacations, designer clothes, endless parties. She loved it. And honestly, she made no apologies for that. Candy liked beautiful things, and she surrounded herself with them. But here's the thing about perfect stories: they usually aren't. Not really. Because behind the diamonds and luxury cars, behind the extravagant lifestyle and picture-perfect photos, something darker was brewing. Something that would unravel their entire world. And it all started with a single, unexpected act of kindness. You see, Jacques, in true Jacques fashion, did something that most millionaires probably wouldn't. One night, he was watching the news when he saw a story about a man who had murdered his pregnant wife in a psychotic break. It was horrific. But what caught Jacques' attention wasn't the killer. It was the 4 children left behind, orphaned, alone. And just like that, Jacques made a decision. He and Candy would adopt them. 4 kids, just like that. Taken in and raised by 2 people who already had everything and now wanted to give back. For a while, people saw them as this beacon of hope. Wealthy, generous, family-oriented. It was almost too good. And yeah, for a moment, maybe it really was that good. Candy and Jacques, they had built this empire together. This massive house filled with kids' wealth, success, charity. But good doesn't always last. And for the Mosslers, their perfect image was about to be shattered by something so scandalous, so twisted, it would leave even the most seasoned detectives stunned. It started with a phone call, a visit, a young man named Melvin, Candy's nephew. But we'll get to him in the next chapter. Chapter 2. A nephew, a secret, and a dangerous affair. If this story had ended with a fairy tale mansion and adopted children, maybe we wouldn't be here. But of course, it didn't. Because not long after Jacques and Candy built their perfect little empire, someone new entered the picture. Someone who would change everything. His name was Melvin Powers. Now Melvin wasn't just anyone, he was Candy's nephew, her actual biological nephew, the son of her sister. But that didn't stop what came next. At the time, Melvin was just 24. He'd served in the Navy, bounced around between jobs, and most recently, he'd gotten in trouble for running a con in Michigan. The guy had charm, but not a lot of direction. After serving 90 days in jail, he was released on probation, and his mother Candy's sister suggested he reach out to his rich aunt in Houston, just to get back on his feet. So that's exactly what he did. Melvin called Candy, hoping maybe her husband could give him a job or help him get started in business. And Candy welcomed him with open arms. But from the very beginning, something about their relationship just felt off. Now, I don't know if it was the age difference, Candy was about 20 years older, or the fact that Melvin was family. But there was a tension there, a heat, the kind of chemistry that frankly made people uncomfortable. And yeah, I said it, chemistry. Because soon enough, Candy and Melvin crossed a line. They started having an affair. Let that sink in for a second. A married woman living in a multi-million-dollar mansion sleeping with her much younger nephew, all while her husband was in the next room. It sounds like a bad soap opera, but it was very real and very dangerous. Candy would later claim that the affair happened because she was heartbroken. She said she'd discovered Jacques was gay, that he'd been hiding his sexuality for years. According to her, he'd become distant cold. She felt alone, confused, betrayed. And in her words, Melvin was there. He listened. He made her feel wanted. But whether that's the full truth or just a convenient excuse, well, that's something we'll never really know. What we do know is that while Jacques spent more and more time alone at their Florida vacation apartment, distancing himself from Candy and maybe exploring a side of himself he'd never fully understood, Candy and Melvin were back in Houston, getting bolder, more reckless. At first, they tried to keep things secret. Melvin even moved into the mansion supposedly for work. Jacques, ever the businessman, gave him a job as a trailer salesman and allowed him to live rent-free. Candy handled Melvin's finances. Everything looked perfectly innocent on the surface. But behind closed doors, they weren't exactly subtle. The whispers started. People noticed the lingering looks, the laughter that felt a little too intimate. And eventually, Jacques found out. Not because Candy confessed, not because Melvin came clean, but because someone told him. A coworker had seen too much and couldn't keep quiet any longer. They told Jacques what was really going on when he wasn't around, that Melvin was bragging about the affair, that he was only in it for the money, that Candy wasn't so discreet after all. Jacques was devastated. He didn't yell, he didn't rage. Instead, he went looking for answers in the one place he knew Candy couldn't lie, her diary. And what he found there, it broke him. Page after page, Candy had written about her passionate relationship with Melvin, in her own handwriting. The love, the sex, the secrecy, all of it spelled out in graphic detail. It wasn't just an affair, it was an obsession. After that, Jacques snapped. He fired Melvin, kicked him out of the mansion, told the authorities that if Melvin didn't leave, he'd have him arrested. And Melvin didn't take it well. At all. He screamed, threatened revenge, told Jacques that one day he'd be the owner of the mansion, that Jacques would be sorry, and Jacques believed him. He wrote in his own private journal, "If Mel and Candy don't kill me first, I'll have to kill them." That line, it says everything, doesn't it? This wasn't just a messy family drama anymore. It had become something darker, something dangerous, a game of pride, betrayal, and power with a deadly prize at stake. And neither Candy nor Melvin seemed ready to walk away. Their affair didn't end. If anything, it only grew more intense. And Jacques started living in fear. Quietly, alone, waiting for the next move. Because when people are driven by greed and lust and the promise of $33 million, things don't just go back to normal. They burn. And what happened next would make national headlines. But we'll get to that in Chapter 3. Chapter 3. A marriage built on secrets. A fortune worth killing. For so now Jacques knew. He knew about Candy, he knew about Melvin, and he knew, without a doubt, that the two people he had welcomed into his life, his home, and his heart had betrayed him in the worst way. But here's the thing. Jacques didn't go public with it. He didn't storm into court and file for divorce. He didn't expose the affair in the press, even though he easily could have. Instead, he quietly separated from Candy, emotionally and physically. He moved into their Florida apartment full-time, putting space, and maybe a little bit of peace between himself and the chaos back in Houston. But even in that space, Jacques wasn't safe. Because this story wasn't just about infidelity or embarrassment. It was about money. A lot of money. Jacques Mossler was worth over $33 million at the time, which adjusted for today's value would be well over $200 million. And while the marriage was crumbling, the financial ties between Jacques and Candy were still very much intact. Here's where things got tricky. They were separated, yes, but they weren't divorced, and neither of them wanted to be the first to file. For Jacques, there was the issue of image. This was the 1960s, and even whispers of being gay could destroy a man's career, especially one in banking and finance. Candy knew that. And she could easily out him, whether it was true or not. That fear kept Jacques from pulling the trigger. Candy, on the other hand, didn't want the world to know she'd been having an affair with her nephew. That kind of scandal wouldn't just ruin her socially, it would cost her financially too. You see, their prenup had a clause: if Jacques filed for divorce, she'd walk away with half. But if Candy filed, she'd only get a flat $200,000. That might sound like a lot, but to someone like Candy, who was used to luxury yachts, designer jewelry, and a weekly allowance of $5,000, it was pocket change. It wasn't enough. And here's the part that still makes me pause. The only way Candy and Melvin could gain access to all of Jacques' wealth was if he died. Not divorced, not disgraced, just dead. It's a chilling realization, because from that moment on, every move Candy made felt calculated. Every interaction, every visit, every polite conversation, it all had this underlying question: was this woman planning something darker? On June 29th, 1964, Candy told Jacques she was coming to visit him in Florida, bringing the 4 adopted children with her. She said it was a family visit, just a few hours to see the kid's father. And Jacques agreed. Maybe he thought things were finally settling down. Maybe he just missed the children. Or maybe he never stopped loving Candy even after everything. Whatever his reasons, he let them in. They stayed for just a few hours. Candy complained she had a terrible migraine. Apparently she'd suffered from them for years. It wasn't out of character. She told Jacques she was taking the kids to the emergency room for help. And she left. But she didn't go to the hospital. Instead, Candy drove around for nearly 3.5 hours aimlessly with 4 children in the back seat in the middle of the night. Not stopping. Not asking for help. Just driving. And while she was gone, someone broke into Jacques' apartment. There was a struggle. The intruder didn't just kill Jacques. They slaughtered him. He was stabbed 39 times in the chest and stomach. And when he still didn't die fast enough, they smashed a glass bottle over his head, killing him instantly. When Candy returned around 4:30 in the morning, she claimed she walked into the apartment and found Jacques wrapped in a blood-soaked blanket. Dead. She called the police. The crime scene was brutal, chaotic, intimate. And the police knew almost immediately that this wasn't a random break-in. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a jealous ex-lover. This was personal, a crime of passion. Someone hated Jacques enough to stab him over and over again, and then keep going. When police began canvassing the area, neighbors reported hearing shouting and banging coming from the apartment that night. One witness said they saw a dark-haired man in dark clothes running from the building, but they didn't get a clear look. Candy, for her part, was calm, cooperative. She told police that Jacques had a habit of bringing home strange men, implying that maybe this was a hookup gone wrong. Maybe some secret lover had gotten violent. She even leaned into the idea that Jacques was closeted, hoping perhaps that the narrative would steer the investigation away from her and Melvin. But then investigators found Jacques' diary, and everything changed. Inside, Jacques had written extensively about Candy and Melvin, about his fears, about the affair, about the threats. His entries were emotional, paranoid, desperate, like a man who knew his time was running out. And one line in particular stood out to detectives: "If Mel and Candy don't kill me first, I'll have to kill them." Those weren't the words of a man speculating. They were the words of someone terrified. From that point forward, the investigation took a sharp turn. This wasn't about strangers anymore. It was about family. And the deeper police looked, the more disturbing the story became. Bloody fingerprints were found in the apartment. They were tested and they matched Melvin Powers. That alone was huge. But it didn't stop there. A car that Candy often drove, one of Jacques' luxury vehicles, had been reported stolen. Police later found it abandoned at a local airport. And inside, more blood, more fingerprints. And again, they matched Melvin. When police checked flight records, they found out that Melvin had been in Miami on the night of the murder, just minutes from Jacques' apartment. He'd been seen at a bar nearby just hours before Jacques was killed. And one bartender even remembered Melvin asking for an empty glass Coke bottle, the same kind that was likely used to smash Jacques' skull. Within days, police arrested Melvin Powers for first-degree murder. And Candy, well, Candy wasn't far behind. But we'll talk about that and what happened in that courtroom in Chapter 4. Because if you thought the crime was shocking, wait until you hear what the jury decided. Chapter 4. A trial of scandal strategy and a shocking verdict. So Melvin was arrested. And not just for suspicion, police were confident. They had his fingerprints both at the crime scene and inside a stolen car. They had a motive, and they had timing. He was seen in Miami near Jacques' apartment the very night of the murder. It all pointed to him, and yet somehow, things weren't as straightforward as they seemed, not when Candy Mossler was involved. When Candy found out Melvin had been arrested, she didn't panic. She didn't retreat. No, she did what she always did. She went on the offensive. She hired one of the top criminal defense attorneys in the country, someone known for winning the impossible cases. She made sure Melvin had the best legal protection money could buy. And then a few weeks later, Candy herself was arrested, charged as an accessory to her husband's murder. Let's pause here for a second. Because this was a woman who had been living a life of unimaginable luxury yachts, estates, high society galas. Now she was facing the very real possibility of spending the rest of her life behind bars. And her alleged partner in crime, her nephew, her lover. It's the kind of story that makes headlines, and trust me, it did. The trial of Candy Mossler and Melvin Powers became a media circus. People couldn't get enough of it. A millionaire murdered. A wife accused of plotting it. A twisted love affair between an aunt and her nephew. It had everything: sex, scandal, money, betrayal. And at the center of it all was one simple question: did they do it? Now the prosecution believed they had built a solid case. They painted a picture of two people consumed by greed and lust. Candy desperate to maintain her lifestyle. Melvin hungry for power status and a fortune he didn't earn. And Jacques in the way. They presented evidence photos of Candy and Melvin together on vacations at ski resorts and nightclubs. Witnesses testified that the two had a deeply intimate relationship. Some even claimed that Candy had spoken openly about wanting Jacques dead. They argued that Candy lured Jacques into a false sense of peace, visiting him with the children, pretending things were normal, while Melvin slipped into Miami, got close, and killed him. The prosecution claimed that Candy intentionally left the apartment that night under the excuse of a migraine to make sure Jacques was home alone. They believed Melvin used that time to sneak in and commit the murder. They even brought in the bartender from a nearby lounge, the one who said Melvin had asked for an empty glass Coke bottle. That same type of bottle was believed to be the weapon used to end Jacques' life. It was compelling. It was detailed. It made sense. But the defense? Well, they had a different plan. Instead of denying the affair, they leaned into it. They acknowledged the relationship between Candy and Melvin, but they insisted that having an affair doesn't make you a murderer. They questioned the fingerprints. Could they have been left behind from earlier visits? There was no DNA testing in the 60s, no way to prove when the prints were made, or if the blood actually belonged to Jacques. It was all circumstantial. And then they went after Jacques himself. Candy took the stand and testified calmly, emotionally, that Jacques had a long history of picking up male lovers, that he'd brought strangers into their home, that he was living a secret double life. The defense argued that any one of those unknown men could have killed Jacques out of jealousy rage, or who knows what else. To be honest, it felt like a distraction, but it worked. The jury deliberated for over 16 hours. 16 hours of weighing motive, opportunity, evidence, and scandal. And when they returned, the courtroom was silent. Their verdict: not guilty. Not guilty. Candy and Melvin were acquitted on all charges. It was shocking. To everyone. The press, the public, even the investigators. Because even though there wasn't a smoking gun, the pieces still seemed to fit. The motive, the timing, the fingerprints, the affair, the money. It was all there. But the jury said it wasn't enough. The evidence, while compelling, was all just a little too circumstantial. No one had seen Melvin commit the crime. There was no murder weapon with his DNA. No confession. No clear trail. They couldn't convict on maybes. And just like that, Candy and Melvin walked free. It didn't matter that they were lovers, or that they had everything to gain from Jacques' death, or that Jacques had written in his diary that he feared they'd kill him. In the eyes of the law, they were innocent, but in the court of public opinion, that was a whole different story. The press went wild. The headlines wrote themselves. America was watching, stunned, fascinated, outraged. Candy, ever the socialite, threw a party to celebrate her freedom. I'm not kidding. She literally hosted a party after the trial, surrounded by friends, champagne, and photographs. Guests signed a poster from the trial, like it was some twisted souvenir, and Melvin? He didn't waste time either. He showed up to the party, smiling, confident, already planning his next business moves. If this were fiction, it would feel over the top. But this was real life. Two people once at the center of one of the most scandalous murders in American history had just walked out of court clean and free. No jail time, no consequences, no remorse. And they were only getting started. Because while Jacques was gone, his money was not, and Candy. She knew exactly what to do with it. But we'll talk about that in Chapter 5. Chapter 5. Wealth, Reinvention, and the Price of Freedom. You would think that after standing trial for murder after your private life had been ripped open in front of a courtroom and the entire country, you'd want to lay low, maybe disappear for a while, reflect, rebuild. But not Candy Mossler. No, she did the exact opposite. Within days of the verdict, Candy was back in the spotlight, throwing a party. Not a quiet family dinner, not a moment of gratitude. A party. Guests mingled around the mansion, sipping cocktails, laughing under chandeliers, while Candy's children passed around a blown-up poster from the murder trial for people to sign like it was some kind of party souvenir. It was surreal, almost performative. Like she wasn't just celebrating her freedom, she was mocking the entire justice system that had granted it to her. And the money, she got it all. Jacques' entire estate, his companies, his real estate, his investments now belonged to her. She rebranded the business under her own name, Candy Mossler Enterprises. She had won, legally, publicly, financially. Everything she wanted was now in her hands. And Melvin, well, things didn't turn out quite so fairy tale for him. Not long after the trial, the love story that had defied law and logic began to unravel. Candy and Melvin split quietly. No dramatic scandal this time, just a slow fade-out. Maybe it was the pressure, the attention, or maybe they had already taken from each other everything they needed. Still, Melvin bounced back, or at least he tried to. He dove into real estate dressed in designer suits and sailed around Houston in a luxury yacht. At one point, he even extended the length of his yacht by 23 feet just because he could. He made headlines again in the 70s and 80s, not for murder this time, but for business dealings, bankruptcies, and lavish comebacks. It was like the man couldn't be touched. But Candy. Candy's life took a different turn. In 1971, she remarried to a man named Barnett Garrison, a businessman from Texas. For a moment, it seemed like she had moved on, maybe even changed. But then, just 1 year into the marriage, Barnett suffered a mysterious accident. He fell from the balcony of their mansion and sustained serious brain damage. He ended up in a coma, and Candy, she left him, just walked away, and people started whispering again about Candy, about how the men in her life always seemed to suffer when they got too close, about how convenient their tragedies always seemed to be. By 1976, the story finally came to an end. Candy Mossler was found dead in a hotel room in Miami. She was wearing nothing but a lace robe with a full face of makeup, just like always. The cause of death? An overdose. Whether it was intentional or accidental, no one knows. Her age at the time. That's the strange part. Even in death, no one could agree. Some sources say she was 55. Others say 62. One report said 66. It's hard to say for sure because Candy had spent her entire adult life hiding her age. It was like the final layer of her carefully controlled image refused to come off even at the end. As for Melvin, he lived for decades after Candy's death. He kept up appearances, bought properties, lost fortunes, gained them back. He was flashy, flamboyant, and always just a little bit mysterious. Some said he was brilliant. Others said he was just lucky, maybe both. And in 2010, at the age of 68, Melvin Powers was found dead in his Houston home. The cause of death, undetermined. And that's where the story ends. No prison sentence. No real accountability. Just two people who walked through fire, not only untouched, but richer, freer, and somehow unbothered. And what happened to the 4 children Jacques and Candy had adopted? That's the part that breaks my heart the most. Because after everything after the murder, the media storm, the trial, the lies, the scandal, no one really knows what became of them. They were forgotten, erased from the headlines. Just children lost in the shadow of adult ambition and cruelty. Sometimes people ask me, do I think Candy and Melvin were guilty? And the answer is, I don't know what I think, but I know what I feel. I feel like the system failed Jacques. I feel like money, charm, and privilege bought more than lawyers they bought freedom. And I feel like sometimes the truth doesn't matter as much as the story people are willing to believe. That's the most chilling part of all, because if you're wealthy enough, connected enough, and unashamed enough, you can rewrite almost anything, even murder. Chapter 6. The Echoes That Never Fade. Even now, after all these years, I still find myself thinking about this story, about Candy, about Jacques, about the choices people make when power, pride, and money are at stake, and more than anything, about how easily the truth can be buried. Because here's the thing, if you strip away the mansions, the courtrooms, the headlines, and drama, what you're left with is something deeply human. A man who built everything from the ground up, only to lose it all to betrayal. A woman who wanted more, no matter the cost. And a world that, for whatever reason, let her win. That's what sticks with me the most. Not just the affair or the scandal or the murder itself, but the fact that 2 people could walk into a courtroom stand trial for someone's brutal death, and then walk out the front door without so much as a scratch on their record. I've thought a lot about that jury. 16 hours of deliberation. 16 hours to decide the fate of 2 people. I wonder if they regretted it later, if deep down they knew, or if they really believed they were doing the right thing, that they couldn't convict someone just because the story felt dirty and wrong, that without undeniable proof, their hands were tied. But justice isn't always about proof. Sometimes it's about patterns, about who stands to gain and who ends up buried. And in this case, Jacques ended up buried, while Candy inherited his entire world. I still wonder what was going through Jacques' mind in those final months. Did he know it was coming? Was he constantly looking over his shoulder? Sleeping with one eye open, that diary entry. If Mel and Candy don't kill me first, I'll have to kill them. That wasn't just a passing thought. That was a cry for help, and no one listened. And what about the children? That's the part that haunts me most. 4 innocent kids already orphaned, once adopted into a home that looked safe, stable, even loving. And then that illusion shattered, their adoptive father murdered, their adoptive mother accused. The man who once shared their dinner table standing trial for killing the only real father figure they may have ever known. What happens to a child after that? Where do they go? Who do they trust, and who tells their story? Because the truth is, those kids were the silent victims in all of this. Not the media, not the court, not even Candy or Melvin, the kids. But of course, no one asked them. Sometimes I think stories like this hit so hard not just because they're shocking, but because they're a mirror. They reflect back to us just how much injustice we're willing to tolerate when it's wrapped in wealth and beauty. Candy didn't fit the mold of a killer. She was glamorous, charismatic, poised. People liked her. And Melvin Young, confident, well-dressed. He knew how to play the part too. They were attractive, well-connected, and let's be honest, that matters more than it should. It makes you wonder how many other Candys and Melvins are out there. How many other cases never make it to trial? How many people walk free not because they're innocent, but because they're untouchable? That's the real horror, and I think that's why this story stays with me. Not just because a man was murdered, but because so many people watched it happen in slow motion, and still nothing was done. Jacques tried to warn us, through his actions, through his words, through that heartbreaking line in his journal. But when the people with money write the ending, the truth doesn't always make it to the last page. This case may be closed, the verdicts may be final, but the echoes, the ones that never made the front page, they're still here. And they always will be. Chapter 7. What Justice Leaves Behind. There's something about this story that refuses to let go. Even after all the facts are laid out, the murder, the affair, the trial, the verdict, there's a weight to it, a shadow that lingers. And the more I sit with it, the more I realize this wasn't just the story of a man who was murdered. It was the story of how justice can be outmaneuvered, of how charm, wealth, and image can twist the truth into something unrecognizable. I think about Jacques a lot, about how he spent a lifetime building something, not just wealth, but stability, family legacy. He'd come from nothing, worked for every dollar, adopted 4 children not because it looked good, but because it felt right. And in the end, none of it protected him. His kindness didn't protect him. His wealth didn't protect him. Not even his journal, where he practically predicted his own death, protected him. And maybe that's the hardest part to swallow. Because we like to believe that if we play by the rules, if we do the right thing, if we give back, we'll be safe, respected, remembered with dignity. But Jacques wasn't. He was used, then erased. Candy walked away with everything, the estate, the money, the business. She changed the name as if wiping him out completely. And she went right back to living the life she wanted as if nothing had happened. And Melvin, he went on to become a millionaire in his own right. A yacht, flashy clothes, real estate deals. He died decades later in a luxury home, the cause of death still unknown. Meanwhile, Jacques, the man who tried to warn everyone, ended up alone, wrapped in a blanket in a pool of blood. What does that say about justice? What does that say about us? I think it forces us to confront something uncomfortable, that the legal system is built on evidence, yes, but also on presentation, on performance. And when you're polished, powerful, and well-prepared, you can shape a version of reality that serves you, even if it's not true. And in that version of reality, Candy was just a grieving widow. Melvin was a misunderstood nephew. The fingerprints were old. The motive was flimsy. The truth was optional. But I don't buy that. And I don't think you do either, because the truth, the real truth, usually exists in the things people don't say, in the pages of a journal, in the silence of 4 traumatized children, in the smirk of a woman who throws a party after being accused of murder, in the arrogance of a man who boasts that one day He'll own the mansion of the man he helped destroy. Those are the moments that stay with me. And if you've made it this far into the story, I imagine they stay with you too. Because that's what true crime really is. It's not just facts and timelines and verdicts. It's the human part, the messy, tragic, emotional core that we can't stop thinking about long after the headlines fade. So, what did this story teach me? It taught me that justice doesn't always look the way we want it to. That sometimes the people who deserve the truth the most are the ones who never get to speak. And that behind every scandal, there's a silence much louder than the courtroom ever was. The silence of the victims, the silence of the forgotten, and the silence that comes when a story ends. But the questions don't. This was the story of Candy and Jacques Mossler, of Melvin Powers, of Power Image, and how easily the system can be bent if you know how to bend it, and if nothing else. I hope it makes us all just a little less willing to accept what we're told, and a little more curious about what's hiding underneath. Because the truth, it echoes. Always. Chapter 8, When the System Blinks First. Every time I revisit this story, and trust me, I've gone back to it more times than I can count, I'm left with this lingering question. What would have happened if Jacques Mossler had been just an ordinary man? No millions, no mansion, no empire, just a husband, a father, a man betrayed. Would his death have been taken more seriously? Would Candy and Melvin have been held accountable if they didn't walk into the courtroom, flanked by high-powered attorneys and publicists? If their names hadn't been attached to wealth, to luxury, to status? I don't know, but I can't stop wondering. Because here's the thing we're told: the law is blind. That in the eyes of justice, money doesn't matter, looks don't matter, power doesn't matter. But this case, it kind of spits in the face of that idea. The Mossler trial wasn't just about evidence, it was about influence. About how well a story could be shaped, softened, dressed up, and presented to a jury like a carefully wrapped gift. Candy didn't need to prove she was innocent. She just had to be likable enough to create doubt. And Melvin, he didn't have to be a good man, just not provably a killer. And the jury blinked. They blinked because no one wants to believe that a woman in pearls and pastel dresses could orchestrate something so violent. No one wants to admit that a young man in a tailored suit calling someone Aunt Candy could commit murder in cold blood. But people can be both charming and dangerous, loving and manipulative, vulnerable and calculating, and that's what makes this story so hard to digest. Because it refuses to be clean. It lives in the gray. And it exposes something most people would rather not look at: the fact that wealth and guilt don't cancel each other out. They can, in fact, walk hand in hand. Right out of a courthouse, I keep thinking about that party. You know, the one right after the acquittal. People dressed in cocktail attire sipping champagne under chandeliers, signing posters like they were celebrating a movie premiere instead of the end of a murder trial. What does that say about the world Candy lived in? What does it say about the one we live in now? Because this wasn't ancient history. This was 1964. And if you think things like this couldn't happen today, I invite you to look a little closer. The names might change. The houses might be bigger. The headlines might be shorter. But the game, it hasn't changed much. We still live in a world where people with power are given the benefit of the doubt, sometimes at the cost of the people they hurt. And Jacques Mossler, he became a cautionary tale, a footnote in his own tragedy, a man who tried to leave behind a legacy, only to become a victim of the very people he tried to love. I wish this story had a cleaner ending. I wish I could say justice caught up. That Candy or Melvin confessed, that someone stood up and said, yes, we did this, and here's why. But no one ever did. They took the silence with them to the grave. And maybe that's the part we're left to carry: the silence, the uncertainty, the feeling that something was stolen not just from Jacques, but from all of us, who still believe in accountability, in truth, in the idea that right and wrong should actually mean something. I'll be honest, this case shook me. Not because of the murder itself, but because of what came after, the lack of resolution, the way the world just moved on. But maybe that's why we tell these stories, so the world doesn't move on too easily, so people like Jacques Mossler aren't forgotten. So we remember that behind every shocking headline is a very human life, one that deserved more than silence. Thank you for sitting with this story, for making space for the uncomfortable truths, and for listening not just with curiosity, but with empathy. Because if we stop listening, if we stop asking questions, the system gets even better at pretending it never got it wrong. And we know it did. If you're still here, thank you. Thank you for sitting with this story even through the parts that were uncomfortable, the parts that didn't make sense. That's what we do here. We don't look away. We ask the harder questions even when the answers never come. And I'd love to know what you think. Do you believe Candy and Melvin got away with murder? Or was the jury right to let them walk? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story hit you the way it hit me, consider subscribing. This community is built on thoughtful, curious people who care about truth even when it's messy. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and never stop listening for the echoes.